All right. I want to start with this quote from Chris Dixon, and it is inspired by the innovator's dilemma. It goes like this: the reason big new things sneak by the incumbents is that the next big thing always starts out being dismissed as a toy. And some excellent examples of this include personal computers, gaming consoles, and my favorite, the internet in its early days.
Yeah.
And we often make this mistake of dismissing things as a toy because we accept the myths around things and don't question enough. So with that in mind, I want to welcome you to this session, right on debunking the top 10 myths about Web3. My name is Ed Marquez, and I work in the developer relations team at Swirlds Labs. Swirlds Labs is the company driving all the engineering and marketing efforts behind the Hedera network. And Hedera is simply a decentralized public computing system, or a blockchain, that is operated and governed by leading enterprises and universities around the world. In terms of brief background about myself, I'm a mechanical engineer by training, started by focusing on dynamic system modeling and control system algorithm for hybrid electric vehicles. Then I took that one step further, working at an enterprise software firm, doing a process called model-based design, to develop systematically controls code that would be deployed onto embedded systems and embedded devices, for example, in cars, planes, and more. But then as I was doing that, I discovered my passion for Web3. So I was doing a lot of research on the side, but then I was fortunate to the point where the side hobby kind of became the day job. And so here we are. And then more recently, in terms of interests and fun projects, I'm very interested in AI. I actually love ChatGPT as a tool, and recently I developed a ChatGPT plugin for Hedera and basically wrote a tutorial that other developers can use to learn how to write GPT plugins for any type of applications. So that's a little bit of fun there. Now, the goal for the next 30 or so minutes, maybe 25, is for you to learn about Web3 and better understand the potential of this cutting-edge technology. So we're going to start with an overview of what is Web3. Then from there, we're going to dive into debunking the 10 myths. And then we're going to close with some next steps that you can take today in a summary of what we discuss. So starting with the overview of Web3. We all have heard this term. And to do some ground setting here so that everybody's on the same page, Web3 is simply the next evolution in the story of the internet. But it's much easier to understand what this means and its significance in the context of where we have been in that journey and of that evolution. So if you remember, it all started with Web 1, right, the first generation of the internet, that it was all about static content repositories. Users could read content and consume it, but you had to be a developer to be able to produce content. In this case, Danny had to know JavaScript, CSS, and HTML to be able to create Danny's homepage. Then came Web 2, and it transformed the internet, right? That's where we got things like social media, e-commerce, mobile. Things got a lot more interactive, and we discovered user-generated content, basically. We opened the doors for that. But the concern is that it also concentrated power and control in the hands of a few players, right? Control of data and access. And now with Web3, we're in this phase where we're providing new forms of distributed consensus. So the consensus doesn't depend on a single party. And so it is a way for people who do not trust each other or know each other to be able to exchange value in a way that doesn't have intermediaries involved. And so if you think about it, that is what enables a more open and decentralized internet where users actually control their data and have access to different types of applications and true ownership of their digital assets. So it is a significant shift that basically redefines how we interact online. And the cool thing is, it relies on existing infrastructure, right? We still use the same foundational protocols like IP or TCP/IP that exist today. And layer on top of that foundation is where we have the new components of Web3, right? Like blockchains as distributed ledgers for processing transactions and recording those transactions, smart contracts for programmability and complex logic, and also interoperability protocols and bridges that allow the exchange of assets between different protocols or networks. and things like decentralized storage networks that provide that infrastructure that is needed for hosting and delivering content. So all these layers, right, are the backbone of this next evolution. But it's not just about the technological shift, it's also a behavioral and societal shift. And it's also about creating a more open, transparent, and user-centric internet that brings new opportunities for innovation and growth. So that's why it is important that we fully understand what this term means and that we start debunking and looking at the myths around it. So with that, let's dive into debunking these myths. And the first myth on our list is that most people still associate Web3 with just cryptocurrencies or crypto, right? And cryptocurrencies are a significant portion of Web3, but it is just a component of a much larger vision. As I said, the true purpose of Web3 is to create a decentralized internet that enhances user control, accessibility, and value exchanges in a direct way. So it's about building shared digital worlds where users are not just passive consumers of content, but actual participants, active participants that own and control their data. And cryptocurrency is just the native, baked-in way that facilitates those direct value exchanges, right? That's why some people actually call Web3 the Internet of Value. So as part of that larger vision, Web3 actually enables new solutions and improves existing verticals, so things like supply chain, payments, finance, data integrity, ESG, and a lot more. So if we look at two brief examples, the first one is around data integrity and process integrity in supply chain. So this is the Coupon Bureau in the US. They're basically building the standards and the digital infrastructure that is needed to support digital coupons, right? So they're building a system that records the life cycle of events involved in a coupon's life cycle. And in this case, they're using Hedera as their distributed ledger of choice. So it's a big use case that benefits from the transparency, auditability, and the immutability that only Web3 provides. Another quick example beyond just cryptocurrencies is the decentralization of marketplaces. And in this case, EDF, the French energy company, is actually tokenizing renewable energy credits to enable trading these assets without intermediaries. And so these trends of decentralization and disintermediation have enabled similar platforms in other areas. So in areas like finance, in areas like insurance, we're seeing energy markets, and a lot more. So that's important, right? Because those are the types of applications that open up access to anyone, open access to value to anyone with just an internet connection. So while cryptocurrencies are indeed a significant portion of Web3, it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? The real promise of Web3 is in democratizing the web and also bringing power back to the users so that they can have true ownership and participation. And so that's a vision that goes much further than just cryptocurrencies. So that brings us to another common misconception, which is myth 9, where many still think that Web3 is only for small teams and side projects, right? And the reality is that the tech is now at a point where it can actually support enterprise-level applications and large-scale applications, right? And this ability to support enterprises and large-scale projects actually comes from two things, right? The resilience and the robustness that is provided by decentralization and distributed governance. So when you have a decentralized system, each node in the network operates independently, but they follow the same protocols. And if one node, or even a portion of the nodes, stops operating or fails, the network can still continue to operate, whereas in a centralized system, you have a single point of failure. And enterprises care about this resilience because for them, what that means is less downtime, which also means not having to worry about the cost and the headaches that come from that downtime. And typically, most decentralized networks also have distributed governance. So that means that the decision-making power is spread among multiple parties rather than being concentrated in a single entity or a single individual in some cases, right? And that leads to more responsible and transparent systems because those decisions are made as a group and sometimes even with the user community as well. So one example of that decentralized and distributed type of governance is the model that Hedera has, for instance, which is a council of 39 global enterprises and universities. And they come from different geographies, representing different interests, and they even have time limits. So, they're also building Web3 solutions on Hedera. And there are many other governance models out there, right? You have on-chain governance, other off-chain models, fork-based, where developers can simply fork a chain, and developers that want to follow that approach can take that direction. And you even have decentralized autonomous systems, or decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs as well. So, while it is true that Web3 is excellent for small projects, for small teams, it's also well equipped to handle the enterprise-grade requirements and needs that those applications may have. And companies like Deutsche Telekom, Google, MasterCard, Disney, and Starbucks, they're well aware of it, and they're jumping on board with some of these use cases that they're embracing with Web3. Now, speaking of size and scale, enter myth number 8, where many still think that Web3 tech is not scalable. Now, it is true that scalability has been a challenge for Web3, particularly when we think about some of the early blockchains. However, the industry has continuously innovated, and these challenges, have been partially addressed, right? There's significant progress in this area. So when we look at the early networks, early blockchain networks, which are a key component of Web3, they face scalability issues because of their design, right? So a network like Bitcoin doing only 5 transactions per second, Ethereum, even though it has smart contract capabilities, only being able to process 15 transactions per second. And when you compare that to systems like MasterCard and Visa, it's clear why scalability can be a concern. But let's not forget that Visa and MasterCard were scalability solutions to existing slow payment systems that used to exist. But the good news is that the space, Web3, has kept evolving, right? Where we now have third-generation networks like Hedera, Polygon, Algorand, Avalanche that address these scalability challenges, and many of them can process thousands of transactions per second. And some of them can even scale infinitely through techniques like sharding. Now, throughput is only one criteria of scalability, right? There's other things that developers have to consider, like the network fees, the security, the latency or time to finality, the energy consumption. But here, focusing on throughput, just because that's a significant factor that many developers pay attention to. And so here's a brief note about scaling solutions that have come to the space as well, in Bitcoin and Ethereum. They have seen the rise of layer 2 scaling solutions. So things like the Lightning Network on Bitcoin or Polygon on Ethereum, right? And these are solutions that operate on top of the existing blockchains. But they're not all created equal. You have different types of solutions like sidechains. You have rollups, channels, and also child chains. So there's different flavors when it comes to scaling. And, to close this myth, basically what we can say is that scalability has improved drastically and significantly to support that growing number of users and applications in Web3. Now, as more people and more users and applications jump into Web3, what about the environmental impact? And that brings us to myth number 7, which is that Web3 is not environmentally friendly. And it is very interesting because the media loves to talk about the energy consumption of Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is now an outlier when you compare it to other distributed networks in Web3 when it comes to energy consumption, because Bitcoin basically uses a very energy-intensive algorithm. And as part of its mining process, it uses proof of work, which means that the network nodes are actually competing to solve complex math problems and validate the transactions and secure the network. And so that makes the scarce resource computational energy, which directly translates into electricity, right? When we look at other Web3 networks that are much more energy efficient, they use a different consensus algorithm called proof of stake. And these are way less energy intensive because the scarce resource is now the native cryptocurrency of the network, right? So that doesn't translate into electricity. And what we can say from that, or what we can derive, is that these cryptocurrencies, for many proof of stake networks, serve both as fuel and also as a security mechanism for the network. Fuel to pay for API calls, and then for security to validate transactions based on the stake and how that's distributed across the nodes. Now, bringing this back to energy consumption, here what you see are the results from a study by University College London, where it's showing a comparison of energy consumption per transaction, between different networks. And you see how Bitcoin is now the outlier, right? You can also see Visa somewhere here in the middle of the pack compared to these distributed systems. But what you can also see is that Hedera is by far the most energy efficient network per transaction. By the way, the size of the bar is just the energy consumption per transaction in kilowatt hours. And there are other points here to support how Web3 is actually improving its environmental impact, right? The increasing usage of renewable energies and the decreasing cost of that energy. Others make the point that Bitcoin can actually serve as a battery for grid and renewable energy, because in most cases, grid and renewable energy is a use it or lose it type of operation, whereas Bitcoin at least can provide a way to capture some of the value from that energy that would otherwise be lost if it's not used. And the other point is that many of these networks that are actually carbon negative and carbon neutral enable use cases for marketplaces, for things like carbon credits and carbon offsets, and also incentivize more transparent carbon accounting practices, which translates into a positive contribution for environmental impact. So, to consider the narrative that Web3 is not energy efficient, I think it doesn't paint the full picture. And so it also overlooks a significant amount of progress made towards sustainability by the space. So I do find it interesting that the media doesn't really bring up the energy consumption of more traditional systems like central banking or the legacy financial system and gold mining operations. But maybe one day we'll see that energy consumption comparison apples to apples. All right, moving on to number 6. Web3 is not as secure as traditional web technologies. Interestingly, many of these distributed technologies actually use Byzantine fault tolerance to secure their network, and in a few cases, some networks take this a step further, being asynchronous BFT, right? Asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance. And these algorithms basically ensure that the network can still reach consensus, even in the presence of attacks or malicious actors, as long as those malicious actors are less than 1/3 of the network. And if you have a leaderless system, in the case of Hedera, for instance, it makes the system much more resilient to DDoS attacks because basically there's no single point of failure, as we mentioned before. There are other security mechanisms that also guarantee data integrity and confidentiality. So for instance, when you have blockchains or directed acyclic graphs, or DAGs, you can use hashes. You're actually using hashes to ensure the integrity of that data. And these chains of blocks or this chain of hashes actually connects all of that so that it becomes very difficult to tamper with that data. You also have public key cryptography to basically secure transactions, to authenticate transactions. And typically, you have a public key that identifies the user, that the user can share, and a private key that the user can take to authorize and sign those transactions. And the interesting thing is, they're generated using public key or elliptic curve cryptography. And what we're seeing is the adoption of ECDSA and ED 25519 keys, which provide efficiency and security guarantees compared to older key systems like RSA. And finally, the space is also getting better at doing formal verification and doing security auditing to address issues like smart contract vulnerabilities, which have been a valid concern from others watching the space. So this basically goes to show that with things like ABFT security or fault tolerance, advanced cryptography, decentralization, and formal verification, security is actually at the heart of Web3. And at this point, you might still be thinking, OK, I like all these points, but I'm not going to throw away everything that I've done before to jump into this Web3 thing. But the cool thing is that you actually don't have to. And many people think that Web3 tech is not compatible with Web2 languages and Web2 frameworks. But the truth is, it's designed to be interoperable and compatible. Because the way to think about Web3 is more like an evolution rather than having to replace everything and start everything from scratch. Right? It simply adds new layers of functionality and capability on top of the existing infrastructure and protocols that we have. So in terms of tech stack, this is a simplified diagram here, but there are many parts that are analogous between Web 2 and Web 3. In both cases, right, you have a front end typically, and if you look at Web 3 on the right, typically you can add user authentication and interaction through simple plugins and wallets like MetaMask, for example. And also on the right, you can see that the blockchain network is typically a big portion of your Web 3 backend, and that is because those networks typically give you the capabilities of smart contracts that facilitate value exchanges, and also the currency that it allows you to transfer that value. And you also have decentralized storage systems, so things like the interplanetary file system for content delivery and hosting, for instance. So in terms of programming languages, many networks provide tools and libraries in languages that most folks already know. So it's not like you have to learn everything from scratch. For example, Ethereum, Hedera, and a few other networks offer SDKs and libraries to work on languages like Java, Python, Go, JavaScript. And other networks like Near, Polkadot, and a few others offer the capability to directly code smart contracts in languages like JavaScript and Rust, which is very attractive to some folks in Web 2. So again, that transition from Web 2 to Web 3 is not a break, right? It's more of an evolution, and it builds on the foundations that already exist. So the bottom line here is that you don't have to throw away the baby with the bathwater. Now, based on all this compatibility and DevTools stuff, you may be thinking about the next myth, which is Web 3 is only for developers. And it's true in the early days, just like Web 1, where you sort of had to know CSS, JavaScript, and HTML. In Web 3, in the beginning, you sort of had to know all these frameworks and interactions and components that are in the left diagram. But the good thing is, we're seeing the space evolve, right, and rapidly, to basically become more accessible to users. And that's thanks to things like user-friendly interfaces and abstractions that enable users to get rid of all the complexities of blockchain and simply do what they're trying to do. And it's also thanks to integrations with low-code and no-code platforms that are bringing on board citizen developers, right? So people that may have business know-how or other valuable skills, but are not trained as developers. Also, different ecosystems are providing incentives, sometimes in the form of financial incentives. For instance, what you see here is in decentralized finance, some ecosystems are providing yields in the hundreds of percentages. And people think it's scam, but in reality, it's incentives to bring users to drive adoption in the early days. And we also have things like decentralized social media platforms that offer behavioral incentives, right? Like having control and full access over your own data. And so these are some of the key elements making Web 3 more accessible to everyone and not just developers. All right, so now we're in the final stretch. The last 3 myths, and these are actually my favorite because these are very interesting and they bring our human perception and our human psychology into the picture. And this one is that Web 3 is not ready for mainstream adoption. And as we saw before, Web 3 is not an all-in or nothing proposition, right? It's more of an evolution. So it's not about replacing the current web overnight, but more about gradually adding those new layers of functionality and capability on what already exists. And the enterprises, governments, individuals are all starting to understand that. And we're seeing this growing trend of applications that now introduce these elements of Web 3 on top of those layers that we see there on the right. And these are being incorporated in applications that we all consider pretty mainstream. One example of that is tokenization of financial assets, right? For things like bonds, equity, real estate, and fine art. And what you see here is some market research by Polaris showing that the market size for asset tokenization is expected to go from about $2.5 billion in 2022 to about $11 billion by the year 2030. So this is a huge opportunity for Web 3. We're also seeing NFTs replacing cookies and also enabling customer loyalty and rewards programs, innovations or interest by financial institutions like BlackRock, and increasing regulatory clarity, innovations like DREC, or decentralized recovery that is being driven by Swirlds Labs to enable users like Grandma to not lose her keys and not have a backup that is as decentralized and as secure as things that we have already in Web 2. And so the reality is that Web 3 has been growing under our noses for 14 years, and it's already here. And the best part is that it keeps growing every day as well. So it is interesting because many people still think that Web 3 is a fad and it will not last. And so to that I say, the quote from Mark Twain, history never repeats itself, but it does often rhyme, right? The same thing was said about the internet in its early days. And I also absolutely love this quote from Bill Gates trying to explain the internet to David Letterman in 1995, where at the time, sending emails seemed kind of crazy and wild and exciting, and nobody understood it until they tried it, right? So hopefully you're seeing that ultimately it's about being able to do things differently, faster, more cheaply, and with better privacy or even with reduced environmental impact, right? So with that in mind, finally, the myth that we all have to dispel at some point in our heads, myth number 1, which is Web3 is not for me, right? And the truth is, Web3 is for everyone. It's about democratizing the internet, as we said, and enabling those direct value exchanges. So yeah, just imagine being able to legally participate in finance without having to trust or go through a bank, or participating in social media where you actually control your data and maybe you're rewarded to be able to access your data. Or playing games where you can bring your assets with you or cash out if you stop playing your games. So when we say Web3 is not for me, what we're saying is I don't want more control over my online experience. I don't want to engage in direct value exchanges, or I don't want the opportunity to truly own my digital assets. So as we move forward into this new era of the internet, I want to invite you all to explore what Web3 has to offer and to take ownership of your own digital experience, because ultimately Web3 is about building a better internet for all of you. So with that, I'll just jump in quickly into the next steps and the summary. If you want to learn more on your own, I definitely recommend checking out the Hedera Learning Center. If you want to learn talking to a fellow human, developer, and engineer, you can come to our booth. And you also have my respect, because this shows that you already have taken the first step or more steps to learn about Web3 by being here. So here's a summary. If you want the slides, you'll have a recap of all these myths and the truths that come with these myths. And just to close, I do want to remind you, right, that the next big thing often starts looking out like a toy. So do your own research, question everything, and don't let this opportunity of Web3 pass you by. So with that, thank you for sharing your time today.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Thank you.
So we are way over time, so there is not going to be any Q&A on stage, but in the app, in Swapcard, you will find some questions that you can answer directly there, or you can approach him now out of stage. We're going to have our next talk in less than 10 minutes, and it's going to be the last talk of the day. Stay around, because starting from 6 p.m. here, there is going to be party time, and the micro stage 1, we're going to have a drag karaoke going on. So it's going to be funny tonight. See you soon.